Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. My name is Richard Walsh and I'm the Principal Assessor for Energy and Environment, or Environment and Energy, gets written down in various ways, for NQA. NQA, we're one of the UK's major certification bodies, and as you can see, we're represented in a number of locations across the world. We work with clients both locally and globally, and we make sure that we tailor our approach to suit each individual client. So that's the marketing stuff out the way that I'm contractually obliged to say. So how this is going to work, just one caveat to start with. I'm actually working from home today, so I'm sat in my study. So if you do hear any background noise, it's one of two things. There are members of family in the house, but also for this occasion, I'm wearing a 24-hour blood pressure monitor, and that will beep a couple of times during the presentation. Whether the blood pressure readings will go up or not, I'm not so sure. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to talk for about 45-50 minutes, and then there'll be a section for questions at the end. You will get a copy of the presentation sent to you in a PDF format, so there's no need to frantically try and scribble down everything I'm saying. And we also post recordings of these webinars on our YouTube channel. If anybody has any questions, on the right-hand side of the screen, you should see a dialog box, and there is a section in there for questions. So if you want to type anything in there as we're going along, I shall try and answer it if I think that's pertinent to do at the time, or we'll come back to questions towards the end. So what we're going to have a look at is obviously 50,001, just to make sure that you're all in the right webinar. So this is 50,001 2018, the transition essentials. So we're looking at the new standard. We're looking at how this has changed from the previous 2011 version. We're going to have a look at the clauses, what the changes mean, look at the NQA transition process, and then some top tips and a section at the end for questions and answers. Just checking that you can all hear me okay and you can see everything that's on the screen. I always think it's strange asking somebody if they can hear me, because if you can't, how do you know I've answered the question? But I'm guessing that everything's going okay, because nobody's put, we can't hear what you're saying. So the idea about this webinar that's going to last about an hour is to introduce the new key concepts of 50,001 2018, have a look at some of the new terminology and some of the new definitions, look at some specific clauses and the requirements and the evidence that we will expect to see as assessors, look at the transition timeline, some notable dates, and actually new to this one, correct some misconceptions that appear to be doing the rounds in and around the sort of world of certification, and then a little section at the end where I'll give you my top tips on, I think, how we can all work together to get a successful outcome. So there are some overarching concepts that we need to be aware of, that we need to understand, and all of the standards, all of these new revised standards, be it 14,001, 9,001, the new health and safety standard, 45,001, they all have overarching concepts. They all have an intended outcome. And the intended outcome of this standard, as you may not be surprised to realise, is continual improvement in energy performance. Tied into that is the fulfilment of compliance obligations. That's an Annex SL term. We'll see shortly that this standard tends to use the term legal requirements, but that's fine. And above all, to achieve set energy objectives. Also buried within each of the standards is a requirement to manage change, and there is a greater focus now in the new standards on the planning process for change, the management of risk, and also the new Annex SL format makes all of these standards much easier to integrate with one another and indeed with the wider business processes. A very, very quick history lesson as to where this standard has come from. Ultimately, it came out of some original standards back in around about the year 2000, some energy standards via a British standard and European standard in 2009, which is when I first got involved, 16001, and then in its initial iteration, if you like, ISO 50001 2011, which was the first global energy management standard based on, very similar to ISO 14001. This is the standards development timeline. So as you can see there, the original standard issued in 2011, the draft standard came out in 2017, and the current standard now, the 50001 2018 standard, was issued on the 21st of August 2018. And there is a 3-year transition period. So certificates actually expire, sorry, press the wrong button there, certificates actually expire on the 20th of August 2021. So if you don't do anything, if you don't transition, you don't make any plans, you don't involve ourselves, the certificates you have will expire on the 20th of August 2021. Now, I said I was going to correct a misconception. There are a couple, in fact more than a couple now, of certification bodies out there who have misunderstood a communication from UCAS, UCAS being the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. And I was looking at it this morning on 1CB's certification body's website. I won't say who they are, to be fair to them. Their site is saying that 18 months from publication, they are not permitted to do any audits to the old standard. That is incorrect. We can do audits to the old standard right the way through, a little bit past 18 months, but usually to about 6 months before the end of the transition period, we'll stop doing audits to the old standard. The information from UCAS says that UCAS will not recognise any new applications for people to assess to 50001 2011 18 months after publication. So they've actually got it wrong. Don't worry, if you're being told by your certification body that they cannot assess to the old standard after 18 months, which is really going to take us through to February 2020, which is not that far away, it's only 6 months away, then they're incorrect, and push them to say that you still want a little bit more time, because there is a 3-year transition, not an 18-month transition, which is what they're trying to claim. So why did the standard need to change? Why do any standards need to change? Well, obviously to maintain relevance, to maintain the relevance to industry and any other organisations that are using them. The current standard, or the old standard now, I'll call it really, the current standard is the new standard. The old standard had been around since 2011, so it had been around for 7 years. Standards tend to be updated every 5-6 years. Sometimes it drags over to 7, as this one did. And it's to reflect the increasingly complex environments in which we all operate. One of the slight criticisms of the old standards that they seem to be focused a little bit more towards manufacturing organisations. I think the new standards reflect that they can be used by anybody. There is an increased element of corporate governance in there. The new clauses that look at leadership tend to have picked that up, making sure that there is buy-in across the entire organisation, including management at the highest level, be that a board, be that the chairman, be that the managing director, whoever. But ultimately, there was a push from industry for easier integration of all of these management systems. And this standard, the new 50001 standard, has more or less followed Annex SL. However, it has drifted away in a couple of areas, which hasn't really helpful, because if you've got ISO 14001 2015 and then you're coming along and using this standard, in nearly every case the clauses line up. There are a couple of areas that they don't, unfortunately, and we'll look at those as we're going through. So if you've already got ISO 14001 2015, ISO 9000 2015, or ISO 45001 18. You'll recognise this. These are the Annex SL clauses. These are the 10 clauses in the new standard structure. And the clauses we're interested in are clauses 4 to 10. They're what's known as the auditable clauses. And when I or any of my colleagues come in and audit you, it's clauses 4 to 10 that we're concentrating on. Clauses 1, 2, and 3, scope, references, and terms and definitions are there to provide help. Just to make sure that with clarity, clause 1 scope does not refer to the scope of your management system. That comes under clause 4. Clause 1 is the scope of the standard itself and explains a little bit about what it's setting out to achieve. They all follow the Deming cycle, plan, do, check, act. This standard is no different, and this shows the sections of the management system, the energy management system, put into the plan, do, check, act cycle. I tend to prefer things set out in a linear fashion, so here you'll see the same thing, plan, do, check, act, but set out in a linear motion, or linear structure rather, with the sub-clauses hanging below the main 7 auditable clauses: context, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. As I said, it is designed to easily integrate with the other standards you see on the screen. 9, 14, 45, and 50,001 all sit together and have all more or less followed the same Annex SL format. When I saw this standard first published back in 2011, or just before 2011 when it first came out, when it came out as a draft standard, part of me wondered, well, if we've already got 14,001 as an environmental standard, why do we need another standard that looks at just energy? Because surely, if energy is one of your significant environmental aspects, if you like, then you're going to cover it anyway as part of a 14,001 system. So why do we need another standard just to look at energy? Why not one just for how we handle waste, or why not one for how we use raw materials or something like that? It was decided that 50,001 was a bit of a special case, and what it does, it actually takes the energy management, takes the focus on energy to a much higher level. The two standards actually, I believe, after working with them obviously for many years now, I have a number of clients that have both standards, and they complement each other. They are there to provide value. They can be implemented together, and as I say, if 50,001 is more relevant to you, that might be because energy is your main environmental impact, if you like. But ultimately, it takes this standard takes energy management to a much higher level. A couple of things I want to just clarify so that we make sure that we're all on the right track. Terms and definitions, you can read them there. The one that's important is, or the two that are important, the bottom two. Preventive action has now been dropped from the standard as a clause. People still refer to preventive action, and I still audit people who use the term preventive action, but the standard itself has dropped that term. The clauses on performance evaluation, planning are all about taking that preventive action to stop things going wrong in the first place. And ultimately, the bottom one is the most important. Energy performance standard requires that you can demonstrate that you are improving your energy performance. Now, energy performance is not the same, as we'll see later on, as absolute energy usage, and this is a critical point within the standard. And it defines energy performance as measurable results related to energy efficiency, use, and consumption. So energy performance is not just the total amount of energy you use, it's that related to another factor. No questions coming through at the moment by the look of it, so that's telling me we either fully understand what's going on or I'm baffling you all. I hope it's because we fully understand what's going on at the moment. So what we're going to start doing is we're going to start going through the clauses of the standard, and we're going to start looking right at the beginning, clause 4.1, context. So if you've already got 14,001, 9,001 or 45,001 in place, you will understand what we're going to be talking about here. And what this clause is all about is looking at how we operate, how the world of energy, if you like, can impact upon what we do. And it's all about determining the issues, external and internal, that are relevant to what you do, relevant to your purpose, but can affect your ability to achieve the intended outcome. Well, we've already seen that the intended outcome of this standard is that it is there to make sure that you are improving in your energy performance. There is a requirement to consider your context and also the needs of interested parties, which comes along a little bit later on in clause 4.2. But if you do this, if this bit's done properly, it should result in your energy management system focusing on the issues that present the greatest risk, positive or negative, to achieving the ultimate requirements of the standard, which is energy performance improvement. The way I describe it to a number of people is there are things out there that are going to help you, there are things that are going to get in the way. And the standard is all about maximising on the things that are going to be beneficial to improving energy performance and minimising, mitigating, taking into account, reducing the impact of those things that are going to get in the way. Now, the people always say to me, what sort of things should we cover? Now, the standard itself doesn't tell you how you have to do this. It's entirely up to you how you set this out. Through experience, I tend to see these things put into these sort of headings, that there are energy-related things that can have an impact, things like energy supply and availability. Obviously, the weather has a big issue, a big impact on how much energy we use. Climate change, our greenhouse gas emissions, and maybe objectives from the sector in which we work. External legislation, economic issues. Obviously, Brexit appears at the top of everybody's context at the moment. The technological solutions that we may have available to us. And then internal, the strategic direction of the company, the capabilities we have, our culture, other standards that we may have in place, etc., etc., etc. There is no right way and a wrong way. A lot of people use a pestle analysis, which looks at a lot of these and puts them into those sort of silos, if you like. But ultimately, it's all about providing a high-level understanding, conceptual understanding of the important issues that can affect, positively or negatively, how you manage energy. Now, interested parties, clause 4.2, this is one that's slightly broken away from the requirements in, say, 14,001. ISO 50001 2018 does not have a clause on compliance obligations or a clause calling itself legal requirements, legal under the requirements. What this standard has done is lumped them all under the needs of interested parties. And the new standard does stick with the term legal under the requirements. If you've got 14,001, you'll be used to the term compliance obligation. This standard uses the term legal and other requirements, which is what the old standards all referred to them as. Can I assure you, if you have 14,001 and you are transitioning to the new 50,001 standard, it will not matter. If you use the 14,001 structure and having a compliance register under clause 613 of 14,001, it will not make any difference. You will be able to use that structure. It's not an issue at all. And of course, with compliance obligations, you can choose which ones you choose to work with other than any of the legislative requirements. Quickly skip over this slide. I think we know who interested parties are. It's a slide you've seen probably many, many times. Employees, board members, basically anybody who may have a legitimate interest in what we do. Clause 4.3, the scope of the system. So this is the scope of your system. The wording that appears on your certificate is the scope, but also a system, a documented system you might have will go into a little bit more information. You can choose whole or a part of the organisation. If you're wanting to use this for ESOS compliance, and if you were starting out on that route, you're a little bit late because you've only got till the 5th of December to obtain this to comply. But if you have already got 50,001 in place, you can use your certificate as ESOS compliance, either the old version of the standard or the new version, so long as the scope of your 50,001 certificate covers 90% of your total energy usage. But as far as the standard goes, you have to be able to include all energy types. So you can't say we're going to actually disclaim, or we're going to not count this element of our business, because actually we don't want to count that because of the type of energy that's used. The system, if you're going to exclude anywhere, it can't be on the basis that you want to exclude an energy type. The one that's causing a little bit of discussion at the moment is the third bullet point, that you must have the authority within the scope to control energy efficiency, energy use and energy consumption. There's been a number of cases where people have spoken to me and said, we have a little bit of a concern. We're in a fully managed office. Other than switching the lights on and off and maybe controlling the timing on the heating, a little bit of control maybe on the temperature, there's not a lot we can actually do. Does that give us authority to control efficiency, use and consumption? I would say yes, it does. But what we're tending to do on these discussions is to have a one-to-one discussion with clients when we pop in to actually carry out either the next surveillance visit or the certification visit or the transition visit. And then finally, clause 4.4, energy management system, that just says you have to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve your energy management system. And as with the other standards, there is a requirement for continual improvement of the system itself. Would the point 3 include outsourced processes that use energy from you? We'll come back to that question a little bit later when we come on to outsourced processes, because it's quite an interesting debate about outsourced processes and how they use energy. So Dave Smith has asked that question, and I'll come back to that, Dave, if that's okay, a little bit later on. So moving on then into clause 5, this is the leadership clause. There's not a great deal of difference here between this standard and the other Annex SL standards, 14,001 being the main one that I would tend to compare. So the role of a leader within a 50,001 system is, as we can see on the screen there, to make sure that the system is ultimately fully integrated within the business and isn't managed separately. The days of being able to say, well, we have a management system in place, we don't know what it does, but Fred down the corridor, he manages it. We can't do that anymore. We now have to make sure that all of these standards are fully integral to the way the business operates and how we manage that within our organisations. We need to make sure that it's considered, so whether it's energy, environment, health and safety, they're all considered when strategic decisions are being made, and that the objectives coming out of this standard and any other standards we have are aligned with our business objectives. Top management is defined, as we can see there. It's the people or group of people who direct and control the organisation at the highest level. If we've taken a part of the business as the scope, then top management will be the people within that element of the business. So it may be that we've taken a manufacturing facility and drawn the boundary around that. The person who is the senior leader on that manufacturing site would be defined as top management within this system. However, the standard does require that that person, that group of people, do take ultimate accountability for the effectiveness of the management system. We have to have a policy. All of the standards require that we have a policy. I've seen a number of organisations I've worked with that have environment and energy as two standards running side by side. It is possible to have a policy that meets the requirements of both standards. That's not an issue. Quite happy for that to happen, and that wouldn't cause you a problem, certainly with ourselves as a certification body. It has to be appropriate, so you can't pinch somebody else's. It has to provide a framework for setting and reviewing your objectives. It has to commit to ensure that you're going to make information available to anybody, predominantly staff, to enable them to achieve their objectives and your energy targets. There has to be a commitment to satisfy applicable legal requirements, but if you want to use the term compliance obligations, that's okay. It has to commit to continual improvement, and that's continual improvement of your energy performance and of the management system itself. Has to be documented, has to support design and procurement for energy efficiency, and documented, made available to interested parties and communicated. So you can see there's quite a few more things that this policy would require than maybe say an environmental policy would require. So if you're going to have the two together, you would actually need to sort of make sure that the additional energy requirements are in there. Roles, responsibilities, authorities and resources. Now I've quite deliberately moved 7.1, which is resources, into here, because quite often the provision of resources, which does come under support, but ultimately the provision of resources for a system comes from the senior management. So it sits in there within this sort of senior management leadership role. Interestingly, the requirement for an energy manager has been dropped. As with all the other standards, 9001 no longer formally requires a quality manager, 14,001 no longer formally requires an environmental manager. This standard does not require an energy manager. It does require, however, an energy management team. Now, the question that I have been asked a couple of times is, can we have a team of one? And I see no reason to say that you couldn't. And in fact, you can still have an energy manager if you want one. The standard just says that you don't have to have one anymore, but there has to be a team that overall looks at energy usage, energy management within the organisation. If this is all sitting on one person's responsibility and there is no team at all, we might start to want to have some discussions with yourselves about why you feel that energy management is one single person's responsibility. Good practice, I think, would say that the responsibilities should be rolled out across the organisation. Clause 6, which is planning, this is where we get into the real sort of meat of the standard. This is all about now addressing those issues that we identified earlier on in the standard. So in clause 4.1, when we looked, if you remember, the things that we said we're going to help you and the things that we're going to get in the way, this is where we start to do something about that, where we start to plan how are we going to take advantage of those opportunities that we've identified. But also importantly, how are we going to plan to mitigate, to take into account those things that might actually get in our way. How are we going to manage that? How are we going to do that? And it's all about planning to achieve this intended outcome of continual improvement in energy performance. So we have to identify, we have to plan actions. What are we going to do to address those identified risks and opportunities? And we need to make sure that those areas are actually identified, integrated into our system, into our processes, and then we need to be able to evaluate those activities. We have to set energy objectives and targets, and interestingly, this standard retains the term target. 14,001 talks about objectives and planning to achieve them. This standard still uses that term target and relates to energy targets. Now again, some people I've worked with still use the term target in their environmental systems. Some people don't use the word target in their energy systems. It doesn't matter. You can call things what on earth you like. This is just the terminology the standards use. Whatever you call them, the objectives, however, have to be consistent with the policy. So the things that you're planning to do, the things that you're intending to try and achieve have to be consistent with those commitments that you made in the policy. They have to be measurable if they can be, and I think that's why they've used the term target, because in most cases, energy performance is measurable. We can talk about the amount of energy we use, we can talk about the performance indicators, which we'll come on to shortly. You can measure, they are all measurable. You have to consider the significant energy uses. That's a term that the standard uses. That's akin to the 14,001 terminology of significant impacts, significant aspects, significant impacts. They have to be monitored, they have to be communicated and documented, and they have to be regularly updated. And for each of the objectives, we have to plan what we're going to do, who's going to do it, when we're going to do it, what resources, just the same as we do with any other targets, if you like. How are we going to achieve them? One of the newer requirements, and one of the requirements that's been amended slightly, is this terminology for the energy review. The standard requires that you carry out an energy review. The standard requires that it's developed and conducted. If you've already done an energy review as part of your existing 50,001 certifications, that's fine. There's no need to really change it. There is one slight change at the very bottom bullet point. The previous standard had this estimation of future energy use and energy consumption within the management review. It's been lifted out now and put into the energy review. So the energy review looks historically at how you've used energy in the past, looks at how you're currently using energy, what type of energy, how is it being used, where is it being used. It's the identification of these significant areas, and then looking at determining and prioritising opportunities for improving energy performance, and then forecasting. Once we've done that, how's that going to change? How's that going to mean? How are we going to show? Is that going to show that we are going to make a reduction in our energy consumption? So the standard requires that we develop and conduct this energy review. It's going to be updated. It's going to be updated at defined intervals. It's up to you how often you do it, but it talks about it's got to be updated when what it calls the static factors have changed. Now, static factors are the things that, as the name suggests, don't change generally. So your static factors are your buildings, the machinery that you're using, the premises that you're in. If those change, so if, for instance, you suddenly decide to rip out all your lighting and put in LED lighting, that is a change to the static factor and would result in you having to come back and have a look at your energy review. Interestingly, and this is something that disappoints me intensely, in Annex 1 of the standard, which is the second part of the standard, which is not the standard itself but gives guidance, it states that the installation of a renewable energy type within the scope and boundaries of the management system does not represent an energy performance improvement. So it's all about how much energy you use, not how that is generated. And I'm quite disappointed that by installing renewable energy within your boundaries, that is not classified as a performance improvement. So I've mentioned the term energy performance indicators. We have to develop them. We have to come up with performance indicators. And if I'm honest, this is the trick to making sure that you are able to actually demonstrate a performance improvement. So what do we mean by performance indicators? The standard has defined them a little bit better. The standard has hopefully made them a little bit easier to understand. It's actually a measure of energy measured against, or normalized if you like, against something else. So it might be, how many kilowatt hours does it take to produce an item of our production? It might be kilowatt hours per number of staff that we've got, or kilowatt hours per square meter of office space. It's a unit of energy measured against a variable. So we've talked about the static factors not changing. For each of these significant energy uses, you have to identify what the significant variables are. And the significant variables are then turned into your performance indicators. So once we've done the review, we then have to set this baseline. And what the baseline is telling us, it's, if you like, a fixed point in time that says, as at this particular time, this is what our energy use was, this is how we were using it, this is where we were using it, and this is how much we were using. And it asks for a suitable period of time. Now, what we look for, if somebody's coming new into 50,001, is that that significant period of time allows for a full year between the baseline and the point that you are now at, so that you can demonstrate that there is continual improvement from the baseline into where you are now. So for instance, here we are now in the sort of beginning of the second week in July. If your baseline was 2018 calendar year, you haven't got a full year where you can demonstrate continual improvement. So sat where we are now, if your baseline is later than 2017, we would be having a chat as to the appropriateness of that baseline, because you need to have a full cycle, full 12 months between the baseline and where we are now, so that you can demonstrate that continual improvement. And that's a trick that a number of people seem to be missing at the moment, and a trick that I want to actually drive home to you. The standard then says, is a new requirement. So we talked about the fact that the NXSL standards all had a bigger element of planning. We now have clause 6.6 asks us to start to think about at this stage, how are we going to collect our energy data? Performance evaluation and measuring of what we're doing doesn't come until clause 9, but we have at this stage to think about all of the things that we've identified that we want to improve, the things that are going to be these significant energy users. We have to think about how are we going to collect that data. We have to define and implement an energy data collection plan. We have to think about what are the characteristics that we want to measure. How and at what frequency are we going to collect the data, and are we going to retain it? And the orange boxes at the bottom are all of the things that we will expect to see in your data collection plan. And these are the things that you need to do. You need to demonstrate to us to show that you've actually done this properly. Because if you can't do that, when you then get down to doing the data measurement later on, we might find that we've got something missing. I'm going to skip through this next clause fairly quickly because it's not too dissimilar to the old standard and also to the other NXSL clauses. As you know, as we mentioned, 7.1 I've moved into leadership, so that's why that doesn't appear here and we're starting at 7.2. 7.1, all it says is that basically the resources, the necessary resources, have to be provided to make sure that as a business we are meeting the expected outcome, which is improved energy performance. So competency is basically saying that we have to determine the necessary competence requirements. We have to make sure that all our people are competent on the basis of their education, their training, or their experience. This isn't a training clause, this is a competency clause. And we don't have to train everybody. We can deem people to be competent by the length of time they've been working with us, the experience they've gained during that. But we have to be able to demonstrate that they're competent, and we have to identify what competences we're requiring people of an energy management nature, and then demonstrate that they've got that competency, and if there's a gap, allow them to obtain that. But we must, as the bottom bullet point says, we must ensure that records are maintained. Awareness, very similar to the old 2011 clause, that anybody doing work under your control. So therefore, we're talking about here anybody who actually can impact on the energy that we're using. So that might actually be subcontractors, but they have to be aware of our policy and the commitments we're making, how the work they're doing can impact on our energy performance, the things that they can do to contribute to our energy performance improvements, and the implications of not doing what we ask them. Again, communication, it's internal and external. We have to establish a process that looks at what we're going to communicate, how we're going to communicate, and who we're going to communicate with. The new sort of, or the bit that's got a higher profile, is actually the third bullet point in here, and something we will be asking you about is what mechanism have you got in place to enable staff or anybody that we talked about in the previous slide about people who might impact on our performance? How do those people contribute? How can they make suggestions on how we can improve our energy performance? That needs to be a documented, detailed process that we can allow for that sort of feedback to be gathered. So documented information, again, based on the 2011 version. So it talks about documents, control of documents, and how records are maintained. The standard doesn't use those terms now, records and documents. It calls everything documented information. But basically, it's telling us that whatever we use, it has to be controlled, and the documentation we have needs to be focused on the implementation of the system itself. We're not looking for a complicated document control system. It isn't a quality system, so we don't want to be tied down with a really, really complicated document control system. We don't have to have a manual, but whatever we have has to be controlled, available, and protected. Now, this is a slide that a lot of people have actually copied and used, because I've been through the standard, and every single place where the standard says documented information must be maintained or retained, I've put that on here. So if you can copy this out and prior to a transition assessment, tick every one of those boxes that you can demonstrate that you have documented information retained, and documented could be in the form of electronic records, doesn't have to be paper records. If you can tick all of those boxes, you won't be a million miles away from actually having a successful transition. I've called them documents and records because I think that helps focus the mind, but ultimately the standard is talking about documented information. I just think we have a better understanding of the difference between documents and records. Operational planning and control. This is where we now start to put into practice the things that we need to have, the controls that we need to make sure that we are using energy effectively, efficiently, and we're setting out on the journey and demonstrating this requirement for continual improvement. So we need to look at the processes that relate to our significant energy uses. So these are the areas where we use most energy. They might be an individual process. So for instance, one company I work with have a big powder coating oven. That is a significant energy use. It uses a lot of energy, and there are processes, there are controls in place on how that particular process is managed. And criteria has been established on how the ovens are operated, how they're set up, and also criteria set to make sure that the person operating it basically uses those ovens, uses that as effectively and efficiently as they can. And those processes, that information is communicated to the people who actually operate that process. So we're talking about how in this instance, how the oven is operated, how it's maintained. We talk about how the controls are available, how the controls are measured. We look at the way the temperature probes are working. We look at the calibration of those temperature controls. We make sure that any changes, so that any new pieces of work coming through that might need different temperatures, we look at how that is planned. And also we look at the consequences of unintended changes. So what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if say the material that's being used in the powder coating process changes? It may be that the temperature requirements change. We make sure that all of this is controlled, that we know about things, and that there are hopefully going to be no surprises in how we monitor and measure that significant use of energy. We also have to make sure, and this is coming a little bit back to the question that Dave asked earlier, which was, this is going back to scope, include outsourced processes that use energy from us? And that's quite an interesting debate, because it talks about outsourced significant energy uses in this section, which is not quite the same as Dave was asking. But if we do have any outsourced significant energy uses, we need to make sure that they are controlled. And there's a whole debate about what an outsourced process is, and it's not somebody who provides a supply for us. So if we send some parts, so go back to the powder coating oven, if we sent our parts out to Fred's Powder Coating Limited that's 10 miles down the road to be powder coated and brought back, that is not an outsourced process. They are providing a supply to us. It's a supply relationship. It is not an outsourced process, because we're not responsible for how they use their energy. I haven't time today to go into an outsourced process, but anybody wants to contact me directly, I've got some quite good information environmentally, but it applies equally to this on what an outsourced process is. In Dave's question, if you're producing energy and selling it on to somebody else, you're not using that energy. So therefore, that really doesn't fall within the scope of the system, because it's not energy that you're using. You're producing it, but it's not one of your energy uses. Again, it's a quick, simple answer, and I think I would probably want to have a longer conversation with somebody about that. But the simple answer is, if you're generating energy and providing it for somebody else, that energy use is outside the scope of your system, because you're not in control of how that's being used. These next two slides go hand in hand, design and procurement, and they haven't really changed from the old standards. So when you're designing new equipment, new facilities, new systems, new energy using processes, you have to take energy performance into account and make sure that the design of the process and the procurement of the equipment you're going to use in it take energy performance into account. And there is a requirement that if you're procuring equipment that's going to have a significant energy use, you make it known that as part of the tender process, the energy performance over the lifetime of the equipment is one of the key decision-making criteria, if you like, that the lifetime energy usage of something is a required piece of criteria, and you have to make that known to the suppliers. Performance evaluation, clause 9, we have to monitor, measure, analyze and evaluate our energy performance, including that of the management system itself. So we have to make sure that our energy performance is improving, but also that the management system itself is improving, and how we measure how our system is performing. This is coming back to a little bit about the end of clause 6.6, where we talked about planning for data collection. So this is building on this. What do we need to monitor? What methods are we going to use to ensure the results are valid? Do we have to have calibrated or verified equipment? What criteria are we going to use? So this is taking those plans and starting to put them into action, into implementation. What are we going to monitor? When are we going to monitor it? How are we going to analyze the results? How are we going to evaluate what's happening? And then to communicate those results, and basically who needs to know what we're measuring. That comes back to the needs of interested parties, and again retain documented information. One of the things that appeals to me a little bit, it appeals to my sense of humour, is that although the standard doesn't have a clause on compliance evaluation, on compliance obligations, it's decided it's going to have a clause on evaluation of compliance. So this is to evaluate conformity with legal and other requirements. So they've done half a job here. Far be it from me to criticise the writers, but they've done half a job. So they've pinched this clause sort of from 14,001, but they've not pinched the other bit that goes with it. So you're evaluating something that doesn't exist in that terminology. But basically it is all about, as it is with 14,001, pieces of legislation, commitments that we've made. What are we doing? Are we meeting them? If not, why not? And what actions do we need to take to make sure that we are? So this is still a requirement. And if you've got 14,001, you were doing this in the old standard, nothing's changed really, but it applies to all legal and non-legal other requirements that are placed upon us. Internal auditing. This is a clause that hasn't changed. I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly. You can see the slides. The numbering has changed, but basically the requirements for this particular clause have not changed in the slightest. We have to establish a program for audits based on risk, based on how we manage our systems. But the auditing is all about considering, are we improving on our energy performance? Are we meeting our policy commitments? Are we meeting our objectives and targets? And also, are we meeting ultimately the requirements of the standard itself? The management review, again, hasn't really changed. It's a similar clause to the previous version. It has inputs, it has outputs, as we saw earlier. The main change here is the fact that the requirement to forecast forward-looking energy performance has been shifted. It's been moved from here and put into the energy review. Other than that, it's exactly the same. It has inputs, it has outputs, and again, this is lifted straight from the standard. If you can tick that your management review is doing all of that, you won't be going far wrong. I've rushed through those because I want to spend just a little bit of time on clause 10 improvement. So this is a little bit of a controversial clause, if you like, and is built on a requirement that has been widely discussed over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of how energy is managed and improved upon. So the standard clause 10 is all about determining opportunities for improvement and making sure that we do implement those actions that require us to improve our performance in how we manage and use energy. So it's two bits really, making sure that the system improves, but more importantly, in my mind, improving our energy performance. And in the past, this has been a requirement that came in via an additional standard, which I'm not going to go into greatly, but ISO 50003 that applies to us as a certification body. This requirement for energy performance improvement now has its own clause, which is clause 10.2, and I've just moved that forward too quickly. So clause 10, the improvement clause, that there is a clause now which requires you to actually improve year by year on your energy performance. Now, this isn't absolute energy usage. This is the measures that we talked about: kilowatt hours per widget produced, kilowatt hours per employee, or whatever. If you do not demonstrate continual improvement, you will be in breach of clause 10.2. And unfortunately, failure to comply with an entire clause of the standard will necessitate in the raising of a major non-conformance. So this has formalized into the standard what we've been trying to do for a while now, and that is making sure that the standard does give you performance improvement. I'm hoping that that's fairly clear, because this is quite a contentious clause, or has been quite a contentious clause over the years. But it is now enshrined in the standard. Clause 10.2 does require that there is this improvement in energy performance. The other bit, I've taken them slightly out of order. Clause 10.1, this is all about non-conformities and corrective action. This hasn't changed. This is more related to the results of your internal audits and how you raise non-conformances, how you deal with non-conformances, and take you through that process. That hasn't changed. So that's there for information, but there's really no change. Now, I mentioned ISO 50003. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but this is what it is, and this is what has driven the inclusion of this clause 10.2. And it talks about basically the fact that you have to now introduce this requirement for continual improvement in energy performance. It placed some requirements on us, did ISO 50003, and talked about how we did the audits and everything, but ultimately it was about us being ready to make sure that we could audit businesses in terms of the clause on continual improvement. And it brought in these new definitions and these new requirements, which, as I say, have been carried over. So it talks about energy performance improvements, and it's defined as an improvement in measurable results related to energy efficiency, energy use, or energy consumption compared to the energy baseline. And that's what we're looking at: continual improvement based on the baseline that you set. And it defines a major non-conformity as audit evidence that energy performance was not improved. So it's very, very clear: you don't demonstrate energy performance improvement, you will get a major non-conformance. You will be in breach of that clause of the standard, clause 10.2. And that's just reaffirming that requirement. And examples of improvement can be, for instance, energy consumption does decrease over time, so absolute energy usage being decreased is an improvement, but more likely is the energy consumption increases, but the measure of energy performance shows a decrease, or energy consumption goes down based on the performance, the ENPIs, if you like. Quite an issue is this, and it's one that I want to make sure that you fully understand. Now, nobody's asked any questions on this, so I'm assuming I'm getting the message across correctly. But we need to pick the right performance indicators, because what the standard doesn't want to do is to penalise an organisation for growing. But what it's saying is that as you grow, it expects you to use that energy more effectively. Now, the transition process is more or less the same as we had for 9001 and 14001. We are now starting to formally transition our clients. We've been assessed by UCAS against the new 2018 standard, and we are already, and I've already taken a couple of businesses through to transition to the new standard. So all our assessors have been trained. We've been signed off by UCAS, so we are now, if you like, open for business. As we've said there, all old 2011 certificates will expire on the 20th of August 2021. You can do the transition in 3 ways. You can hold fire to your next, basically your next recertification. You can do that. That's probably what we'd recommend. You can transition at a surveillance, at your next surveillance visit, or you can do it at any time. We can come in and do it specially. Most people don't want to do that because there's obviously an additional cost. But you can do it at the next visit if you like. There is no requirement. You can do it whenever you like at the next visit. You don't have to wait to the next reassessment. You can sort of transition at any time. One of the things that's changed slightly, if you were to, let's say you had a surveillance visit due in September this year, if you transitioned at that visit in September, that wouldn't reset the recertification process. It did with 14 and 9001, and that was an internal decision that we'd taken. However, if you transition at a surveillance visit, you will get a new certificate, but the date, the expiry date, will still be the same as the old certificate. Because what we've found is that we've now got, every 3rd year, we've got a huge number of recertifications to do all at the same time, because everybody transitioned towards the end, well, not everybody, but a lot of people transitioned towards the end of the 14 and 9001 transition period. So with 50,001, as you transition, you will get a new certificate, but it won't give you a new date. Doing it that way, it evens it up a little bit. You can have a pre-assessment, and I've already done this with one organisation. We've gone in and done a gap analysis for them on the new standard, and that can happen. Has no formal bearing on the certification process, doesn't count towards it, but it gives you an off-the-record, if you like, idea as to where you are. However, prior to the transition audit, you will be contacted about a month before. We'll double check that you're ready for the transition. And we're looking for 3 things. If you've been through the 9 and 14 transition with us, you will be familiar with the transition gap analysis document. It's on our website. Anybody that hasn't got it, speak to your assessor or speak to me. Send me an email and we can send it out to you. So the gap analysis document, it's called TR006. That's just our internal numbering system. You will get a copy of that. I believe we're sending it out proactively to everybody anyway. You need to fill in the first half of that document. That must be filled in. The second half is optional, and we look for either the filling in of the second half or a full internal audit of the system. One or the other is satisfactory, but there must also have been a management review against the new standard. So, a little bit of a summary. 50,001 2018 adopts the new Annex SL format. It's clarified the requirements for an energy review. It's clarified and provided better information on the normalizing of your performance indicators, and the associated ENB is just energy baseline. It's brought in the new requirements and clarified them a little bit better on data collection planning. And as I say, the text around performance indicators has been clarified to provide a better understanding. So where do we go now? I would use this as an opportunity to take a fresh look at your management system if you've got one in place already. Have a look at our website. I've written a very, very useful, what I believe, and people tell me it is. It's available to download, a gap analysis. talks a little bit about how the transition can take place, talks about the differences in much more detail between the two clauses. See these changes as a way of refreshing your system. See them as a way of an opportunity to improve your system. Make sure that your document reflects the new structures. Make sure that if you haven't already, you've got these new requirements on leadership, risk, and the control and the context rather being brought in. Look at the current controls you've got in place. Are they still effective? Are they giving you what you need? But start out on the premise that every control may have to be improved or amended. And then carry out a gap analysis as to where we're going to go. And I just realised that I'd put some animation in those and I wasn't clicking on them, so I do apologise. So yeah, so just work through those bullet points, but the important bit is to carry out this gap analysis on our form TR006. So questions, we've had a number that have come through. Just a reminder, you are going to get the presentation as a PDF file sent to you within 5 working days, hopefully by the end of this week, but it might slightly go into next week. And if you log on to our YouTube channel, if you're familiar with how to use channels on YouTube, you'll find a recording of this and indeed the other webinars we've done. So one other question, if there's anything else you want to ask, it's now 4 o'clock, so we've done the hour, but I'm around for the next 5 or 10 minutes if you want to hang about. There's one question that's come in, and I've come across this question many times, and I know what the answer is going to be, and I know you're not going to like the answer. Say you have had the standard for 3 years and you have implemented all easy improvements like LEDs and PIRs, data gathering. When there is little more to do, then what will happen if no further improvement is feasible? You will get a major non-conformance. I have taken this issue up with UCAS. At the moment, the answer is that you have to continually improve. And yes, you might have done the things that you've mentioned, things like the LEDs and PIRs. There's what we call the quick wins. They're the easy things. You have to continue to improve. And you have to continue to improve by better management of how you manage your energy. Now, the point I've made, and I've written a paper, which is available on our website, which asks about, is energy performance improvement perpetual? In other words, can you continue improving forever? Personally, I don't believe you can. The standard at the moment says you have to, and it's an issue I've got. Now, we will look very favourably upon this, and we won't just sort of mandatorily dish out major non-conformances. However, it's an area we are looking at, and we will look into. If you say to us, we've done everything we can and we're not doing any more, you will have quite an intense chat with your assessor. And I do fully sympathise because it is very difficult. However, at the moment, the standard is saying you have to. UCAS are saying you have to, and in my little mind, if you continue improving forever and ever, you'll get to a point where you're doing all you're doing and using no energy, and that's clearly never going to happen. However, it is something we will talk to you about, and we will work through this with you. We're not in the habit of dishing out major non-conformances just for the hell of it. So don't fear this, don't worry about it. The guys coming in, the people coming in to assess you, we've been through this, we've had these questions asked of us, and we are happy to sit down and talk to you about it. However, I've no more questions that's been asked. I have a couple of people saying thank you very much. That's fair. Thank you very much for attending. My email address is richard.walsh, W-A-L-S-H, @nqa.com. If anybody has any questions they wish to ask outside of this, feel free to contact me individually. I'm not going to give you my phone number, but richard.walsh@nqa.com. I'm always available for an email question. I quite like those. It gives me a chance to have a chat with you. And I say that whether you're an NQA customer or not, if I'm honest, because if you're not and you've enjoyed it, you might like to think about talking to us. I've no more questions. So as I say, thank you. Remember, any questions, give us a shout. It's nice to see a number of names on there that I'm familiar with, current and past clients. So nice to see you, nice to speak to you. Those of you that are clients of mine, I shall see you in the next 12 months. And thank you very much for your time and sitting in with us. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.